Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapanner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. Are you going through menopause? Are you thinking about menopause? Are you in this weird moment of perimenopause? Are you a young woman who's like, what is in store for me in the future? And then do you hear these stories about like perimenopause being 10 years and you don't know, and when does it happen and when does it start? Are you terrified by it like I am? I feel like everyone around me is talking. I'm a woman of a certain age, 44, and I feel like everyone is talking about menopause around me, in part because I think many of my friends and my colleagues are going through it, and I am obsessed with the pause. I want to know what's going to happen, what's in store for me, what do I need to tell the world, what do I need to tell myself, how do I need to approach it? What I'm hearing quite clearly from people as we talk about it, and if you like this topic, like let us know because we can do more. What I'm hearing from people is they just don't know. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of lack of information. There's a lot of like just women trading stories with each other about solutions or things that help. It's like almost like secret notes being passed back and forth about try that, look at this, because there isn't a lot. Well, while there is a lot of information, there isn't a lot of good information, or women are having a hard time finding that information. So we thought we'd deep dive into the research, right? What can we find from the research about how menopause is being researched and give you some good and accurate information. So on today's episode of Misperceived, we are going to talk about or ask the question like, should you tell your boss about your menopause? Like, should we be at work having a conversation about what are the changes that women are going through in their lives and in their reproductive lives? And should that be shared? Now, we talk about this women's reproductive lives a lot at work, which is interesting because we don't really talk about men's reproductive lives at work, but somehow women's reproductive lives at work are a main and hot topic. And this article that I'm going to talk to you about is talking about, you know, how do women present their menopause at work? How do they think about it? How do they think about how it impacts their lives and their work and their productivity, and whether they should share it. So this is something that I know sitting here in Australia that's being discussed at like many of the governmental levels, at kind of the, you know, policy making levels. And what do you think? Like, should organizations be having a menopause policy or having some sort of resources for women who have menopause to help manage work at this time? Just like you might have parental leave or something like that? Or is that actually problematic? Is elevating this a problem because it makes the risk of discriminating against women at work more common? If employers are all of a sudden thinking, hey, these women are having some sort of drain in productivity, is that actually damaging? I've heard both arguments from both sides. What do you think? I'm going to walk you through an article that's actually talking about how women are managing menopause at work. And it's called Managing Menopause at Work: The Contradictory Nature of Identity Talk. This is an article by Belinda Stefan, and it was published in Gender Work and Organization. Now, Belinda is doing this research in the UK, and she's from Edinburgh, and so she's doing this research specifically in Scotland. So I'm going to give you the context of the UK, but if you're sitting in a country like Australia or the US, the age profiles are pretty similar. So what I'm saying about the UK that came through this article, you can also think about a US or Australian context. You know, she runs through this research that says like, hey, actually, on average, women go through menopause at about 51 years old. But of course, many women know that this is a range from, you know, say 45 to 55, and that actually perimenopause comes before. And so there is this whole a biological cycle that's happening for an extended period of time across women's lives. So this is kind of the prime age. Now, in addition to that, we are increasingly relying on women's labor in the workforce. What I mean by that is women are significantly of this age are a high concentration of the workforce, right? Or they're very likely to be employed currently. And she says in this article that, there's 7 out of 10 women within this age are actually currently employed in the UK. So this is a high group and they're likely to be employed. And many of the policies aren't quite taking account for what's going on for these women. That many women, and she gives this stat again, 80% of women in this age range are having up to 34 symptoms of menopause, and 1 in 4 suffer from severe symptoms that impact their ability to maintain, quote, normal performance at work. I'll read that to you again. This is a quote from the article. 80% of women ages 40 to 55 experience up to 34 symptoms of menopause, and 25%, 1 in 4, suffer severe symptoms that significantly impact their ability to maintain normal work performance. She talks a little bit about other studies that say, hey, this is a pretty prevalent issue that women are going through this life cycle change, and it is impacting how they're stepping into work because it's impacting how they step into life. She then goes on to talk about, which I love, is this idea that women are sexualized at work. And that part of women's stepping into the labor force is their identity of being a quote unquote sexual object or sexual being. Now, what this means is that we sexualize women at work, right? And I don't mean like you. If you're doing this, you shouldn't and stop. But I mean socially. If you watch shows like Mad Men or what was that one that Meghan Markle was on, Suits, right? Like these images of kind of women in professional offices are very, very sexy. They are sexual objects, even if they're lawyers, even if they're advertisers, right? Like in professional positions, it's this idea that part of women in the workforce is women as a sexual object and sexual being, and what kind of value we place on their attractiveness, their appearance, their dress, their makeup, how they look. And that is a piece of what maybe sociologists would call cultural capital, or something that you can trade about yourself to get more money, to get promotions, to get access to opportunities. We did an episode on this where it's like, is beauty valuable or not? And it is a slippery slope for women. So as I'm saying these things, it's not like, yes, you can always trade looks for money, but it is like sometimes, and it's complex. The reason I'm raising this in this article is she talks about the fact that as women transition into menopause, one of the things that could be happening is they become less sexual objects at work. That could mean that gives them more power because no longer are you being perceived as this sexual object, but maybe your ideas and your voice become stronger. But also that you can become invisible and silenced. And I think when I say this, women will feel this innately. Is it a power to have that as a resource, or is it a liability? And what happens when it disappears? Are you marginalized, or are you all of a sudden empowered? Question mark, tell us what you think. And then she talks about the fact that women's bodies, or this idea that in cisgendered women's bodies, when they bring them to work, that there's risk for the employer. There's risk in terms of pregnancy. There's risk in terms of if you have endometriosis, that these kinds of things create a liability, a way in which you are no longer an ideal worker because you need something specific during these periods of time to help support you as an employee. And what they are talking about is like, how does this impact the way in which workplaces view women, right? Like they can go in both directions. And this is where I asked you at the start, is it important to raise this as visibility in terms of saying, hey, workplaces, 80% of women who are going through this have some symptoms. It affects the way in which they work. You need to make concessions. Or does that create a liability whereby an employer or a workplace will say, well, God, I'm not going to hire menopausal women because they're going to be less productive, or they're going to be less engaged, or they're going to need extra time off. That, I think, is a conversation that needs to be had. And again, I don't think there's a simple answer on this, but if you're interested in it, we can explore that conversation a little bit more. So what she's doing in this is actually thinking about the way in which women are interpreting this. And what she talks about in this study is that, like, basically she did a study on something else with women of this age, and they kept bringing up menopause in this study, right? She was interviewing women at this age, and they kept talking about it, the way in which menopause was structuring their experiences at work. And she talks about it in a way where she says, like, yes, menopause is creating some symptoms that actually do impact our bodies and our ability to move through the world. It could be things like reduced energy, anxiety, irritability, hot flashes, limited concentration that, sometimes you can forget a thought. And some of these things, if they happen to you in the workplace, like they can create an embarrassment, they can make you feel shame, and they can be seen as problematic. So how do you think about these symptoms? She's interested in the way in which women who are currently working and who are going through menopause are thinking about these issues. She draws on a sample of 21 women. They're living and working in Edinburgh, UK, and she's going through what they identify as kind of how they are showing up at work, how menopause at work is impacting their experiences. A key finding for her is, quote, experiencing menopause at work led to negative identity talk in how women portrayed themselves or felt they were perceived by others. And then she goes on to say that actually the discussion of menopause symptoms was internalized by women through a range of negative self-talk, and that they were trying to kind of reconcile what was happening within their bodies and the tension between that and being a productive worker, that and making sure you're showing up and being, quote unquote, the ideal worker. She talks a little bit about this idea that we're supposed to have this neoliberal identity of menopause endurance. And that is the idea. I think anybody can feel this. Like, no matter what is happening in your life, you're supposed to show up with endurance at work. It's not supposed to blend across. You're supposed to be productive. It's never supposed to interrupt. And you're supposed to maintain your productivity, your status, being your hard work, even if you're having all these things happening in your home life. Now, when we did interviews during COVID, what we were hearing quite clearly is that erased some of that, right? With that, there was an inability to keep those strict boundaries, and workers really liked that. They wanted to show up as their full selves because I think they had felt like it took a lot of energy to hide what was happening for them at home and not have it bleed into work, even though it was bleeding into work. So she's talking about this through menopause, and she says that what happens is that these women talked about three kind of overlapping themes. They talked about coping through silence. You were coping through the silencing about it, coping with unknown bodily changes, and coping by hiding an aging body. She said that the women were saying that when they were in menopause, they were finding that they were more emotionally reactive. They were more tired. They were less resilient. They were more vulnerable. And they were trying to hide some of that, learn to live with it so it didn't bleed into work. They talked about the fact that, everyone is having a different experience and all this change is like different stages and it's not consistent. And so there is a way in thinking about the difference within that, but the ways in which that wasn't necessarily talked openly, and you kind of had to keep that hidden. And many were talking about their symptoms intensifying and ultimately saying like, hey, I can't do this anymore because this is impacting my body. But for some of them, they were talking about going to a doctor or getting some hormone replacement therapy or something that would help was kind of like the last resort. So it was like, I'm going to cope with this in silence. I'm going to try to respond to my bodily changes. I'm going to try to hide it. And then when things become too much, women step in and try to identify solutions. But it was only like, it's almost like it was a personal failure. Like it was a personal failure to have to actually ask for more or ask for something different. This was how I was reading her article, and the quotes that were coming through is like, I'm going to just try to will my body into submission and pretend like nothing's happening. But then when that fails, God, I'm a personal failure and I guess I'll have to seek help. And that was in part some of the invisibility. She talks about this thing called menopause talk. And it's basically this idea that women are kind of like not having this understanding of their bodily changes, or it's happening to them in a rapid way, in a diverse way. Each woman is happening different, but it almost feels like there isn't enough knowledge there to understand, right? Like it's almost happening to us. It's reactive rather than proactive. And that created this lack of confidence as your body was aging at work. And she was talking about these women who are really like confident and stepped into work in really confident ways. All of a sudden it felt like their confidence was undermined because these things were happening in their body that they couldn't control and they couldn't hide, or they were trying to hide, but it made them unnerved, and they were thinking about the ways in which other people were perceiving them at work. And the result of that was there was a lot of internalized hate talk. That's what I would call it. But she calls it emotive, fearful, negative, and self-deprecating talk. She talks about things like women describing themselves as a hot emotional mess, as a weeping wreck, or thinking you're a disaster. I felt so terrible. I'm too frightened. I'm hiding. And so women were really punishing themselves for this biological transition. And they felt like they should be in control and overcome it. They talked about this negative emotion that kept getting talked about: a torment, a terror, disconcerting, panic, emotional wave, isolating, and struggle. And so this was something that was hidden and the individual internalized and did in isolation. And ultimately that women had to kind of endure this, that they had to get themselves together, that they had to come with a can-do attitude, that they were responsible for overcoming this thing, that they had internalized negative self-talk. She talked about one woman who changed her outfits because she felt embarrassed about the changing in her body. So she wore more kind of baggy clothes because she didn't want to be perceived as, her body changing at work. So what can we learn from these 21 interviews coming about how women are perceiving themselves in terms of menopause at work? Is it in fact a misperception? Like, should you be telling your boss that you are going through the menopause and that these things are changing? This research suggests you aren't. Many of us are not. That it's happening kind of in isolation and in hiding, that perhaps what I described at the beginning and what I'm hearing from people around me of this kind of passing notes, silent talk amongst women hasn't trickled up into the organizational structure, or as it is, there's still fear and hesitation about it. Should you go and talk to your boss about it? I mean, I think we should be having more conversations about this in a way that's open and honest and empowering. And I think we should be a little bit mindful of the ways in which I think these women are thinking about the penalties they're going to get. They're worried about becoming invisible. They're worried about losing their power and their structure. They're stressed about the idea that they're going to show up somewhere and they're going to have a hot flash. And then what are they going to do? They're feeling embarrassed if their brains aren't working as effectively. We need to normalize these conversations, whether that happens in the workplace first. I don't think so, because I think that's high risk for people. And we're asking vulnerable people to be vulnerable in circumstances that can be particularly detrimental. So my advice would be not yet, not now. I've heard a lot of stories about women in their 50s who are finding that they're losing their jobs, they're being pushed out of the labor market and finding it very, very difficult to step back in and to be hired. I worry that some of this menopause talk might actually be shrouding that experience. And so we probably actually need is really good data and measurements about this to understand the ways in which bosses, employers, women themselves may be holding unconscious or conscious bias against this process and this experience. And that conversation probably should happen outside the workplace first. If it happens in the workplace, it should be in a place where there's safety, where there's not fear of retribution, and where people can feel like they can honestly share without some sort of penalty. If you think your workplace is that place, hire me. I would like to work with you. And have those conversations there, because actually it's important, I think, to have the conversations with everyone so we can understand this. But there's always this kind of double-edged sword. And this is, I think, why women have such a hard time at work, is you're always managing these very competing expectations to be both beautiful and sexy and desirable, but serious and powerful and engaged, or to show up with your body that is changing based on different menopausal or biological components, but then pretending like that isn't happening. We don't do that to men. We don't say to men, you have to keep half of yourself hidden. Well, sorry, we do around caregiving. We tell men to hide their caregiving. So men are balancing that piece, and we hear that through our interviews. But we don't necessarily tell men to hide their bodies or hide their transitions or hide their anger or hide their emotional state or hide their hormonal fluctuations. We just assume that they're baseline all the time, and women are undulating all the time and they have to be a baseline. I could just go on about this for hours, but what nonsense. So we need to have these conversations in a more open and honest way, and in a way that actually allows women's voices to be heard, for them to learn more with high quality information and make better decisions. In conclusion, do you want me to be that place where we have these conversations? If so, let me know. Somewhere, LinkedIn, at Misperceived Podcast, at Prof. Leah. As per usual, I love you. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD. You just get to come hang out with me and share through your stories. We want to learn more about what you want to learn more about. Bye. Mwah. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.